In the fading light of a crisp autumn evening, Dr. Marcus Shaw stood before the imposing gates of Blackthorn Asylum, his breath forming ghostly wisps in the chill air. The rusted iron bars loomed before him, their intricate patterns twisted into grotesque faces that seemed to leer at him in the gathering darkness. Beyond the gate, a winding path snaked through overgrown grounds, leading to the asylum proper, a gothic monstrosity of crumbling stone and shattered windows that clawed at the darkening. Dr. Shaw, a man of science and reason, felt an involuntary shudder course through his body. He had come to Blackthorn at the behest of a mysterious benefactor, one whose letter had piqued his professional curiosity and challenged his steadfast belief in the rational world. For years, Shaw had made a name for himself by debunking claims of the paranormal, treating patients whose minds had been shattered by delusions of otherworldly horrors. Yet here he stood, on the threshold of what many claimed. As he pushed open the creaking gate, the weight of his decision pressed upon him. The letter, written in an elegant but shaky hand, had spoken of trapped souls, of spirits crying out for understanding. It had challenged him to spend several nights within the asylum's walls, to prove once and for all that the stories of hauntings were nothing more than the product of fevered imaginations. Nonsense, Shaw muttered to himself, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence of the asylum grounds. Nothing more than local superstition and mass hysteria. Yet even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. The very air seemed to thicken around him as he approached the asylum's main entrance, a grand doorway flanked by weathered statues of angels, whose faces had long since eroded into nightmarish visages. With a deep breath, Shaw pushed open the heavy oak door, wincing at the ear-splitting shriek of rusted hinges. The sound echoed through the cavernous entrance hall, stirring up eddies of dust that danced in the weak beams of his flashlight. The beams swept across peeling wallpaper, shattered mirrors, and overturned furniture, all frozen in time since the day Blackthorn had been abandoned nearly a century ago. As Shaw's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he became aware of an oppressive silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. It was more than mere quiet. It was an absence of sound so complete that it felt almost alive, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation. "Hello?" he called out, immediately regretting the decision as his voice bounced off the walls, distorting into something unrecognizable and inhuman. No answer came, save for the settling of the old building around him. Shaw shook his head, chiding himself for his momentary lapse into paranoia. He was here to disprove such foolishness, not indulge in it. With measured steps, he began to explore the ground floor of the asylum. Each room told a silent story of abandonment and decay. In what must have once been a communal area, Shaw found scattered chairs and tables, some still bearing the scars of long-ago card games. A chess set lay on its side, its pieces strewn across the floor like fallen soldiers on a forgotten battlefield. As he moved deeper into the asylum, Shaw couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. More than once he whirled around, certain he had caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision, only to find empty corridors stretching into darkness. "Tricks of the light," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. In what appeared to be an old nurse's station, Shaw found stacks of patient files, their pages yellow with age and curling at the edges. Curiosity piqued. He began to leaf through them, his scientific mind eager to understand the history of this place. The files told a grim tale. Page after page spoke of treatments that made Shaw's blood run cold, lobotomies performed with callous regularity, experimental drugs administered without consent, and electroshock therapy used as punishment rather than treatment. The names of the patients blurred together, a litany of the forgotten and the damned. One name, however, stood out: Dr. Elias Vance, the asylum's last warden. Shaw frowned, recalling fragments of the stories he had heard about Blackthorn. Vance had been a controversial figure, a man whose methods had been questioned even in an era when asylum practices were notoriously cruel. According to legend, it was under Vance's watch that the true horrors of Blackthorn had unfolded. As Shaw pondered this, a sound cut through the silence, so faint that at first he thought he had imagined it. He stood perfectly still, straining his ears. There it was again, a whisper, barely audible, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Help us." Shaw's heart began to race. his scientific mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Wind whistling through cracks in the walls, perhaps, or the settling of the old building. Yet even as he thought this, the whisper came again, louder this time, unmistakably human. "Please, help us!" Swallowing hard, Shaw forced himself to speak. "Who's there? Show yourself." His words echoed through the empty halls, met only by silence. Then, just as Shaw was about to convince himself that he had imagined the whole thing, a crash sounded from somewhere above him, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Without thinking, Shaw bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. The upper floor was, if possible, even more decrepit than the ground level. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out with grasping fingers. "Hello?" Shaw called out again, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain calm. "Is someone there?" The footsteps had ceased, but as Shaw stood there, heart pounding in his chest, he became aware of a presence. It was as if the very air around him had thickened, becoming charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Slowly, almost against his will, Shaw turned to face the end of the corridor. There, in the shadows, he saw something that defied all logic and reason. A figure stood there, indistinct and wavering, like a reflection in troubled water. As Shaw watched, frozen in place, the figure began to move towards him with a jerky, unnatural gait. Panic seized him, and Shaw stumbled backwards, nearly losing his footing on the rotting floorboards. The figure continued its advance, and as it drew closer, Shaw could make out more details that sent a wave of terror crashing over him. The figure was that of a man, or what had once been a man. Its flesh was pallid and decaying, hanging in strips from a skeletal frame. Empty eye sockets stared at Shaw with an intelligence that should not have been possible, and its mouth gaped open in a silent scream. Shaw's scientific mind reeled, unable to process what he was seeing. This was impossible, a hallucination brought on by stress and the power of suggestion. Yet even as he thought this, the apparition reached out a bony hand towards him. With a cry of terror, Shaw turned and fled, not caring where he went as long as it was away from that horrifying specter. He ran blindly through the asylum's maze-like corridors, his footsteps thundering in the silence. Behind him, he could hear the shuffling gait of the thing pursuing him, always just a few steps behind. Rounding a corner, Shaw found himself face to face with a dead end. Panic clawing at his throat, he spun around, preparing to face his pursuer, but the corridor behind him was empty, silent, and still. Gasping for breath, Shaw leaned against the wall, his mind racing. What had he seen? It couldn't have been real. And yet, the memory of those empty eye sockets boring into him sent another shudder through his body. As his breathing slowly returned to normal, Shaw became aware of a new sound. A soft, rhythmic thumping coming from behind the wall he was leaning against. Frowning, he pressed his ear to the peeling wallpaper. The sound was clearer now. A steady beat, like a heartbeat, Shaw whispered, his eyes widening in disbelief. He pulled away from the wall as if it had burned him, staring at it in horror. The thumping continued, growing louder with each passing second. And then, to Shaw's utter disbelief, he saw the wallpaper begin to pulse in time with the beat, as if something alive was trying to push its way through. With a strangled cry, Shaw turned and ran once more, no longer caring about his scientific reputation or his mission to debunk the asylum's myths. All he wanted was to escape this nightmare, to feel the cool night air on his face, and leave Blackthorn far behind. But as he ran, Shaw began to realize that something was terribly wrong. The corridors seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that defied the laws of physics. Rooms he was certain he had passed before appeared in impossible locations, and staircases led to floors that shouldn't have existed. Exhausted and disoriented, Shaw finally collapsed in what appeared to be an old operating theater. Surgical tools, crusted with decades-old blood, lay scattered across the floor. In the center of the room stood an operating table, its leather straps frayed but still intact. As Shaw struggled to catch his breath, a new sound reached his ears, voices, dozens of them whispering just at the edge of hearing. He strained to make out the words, but they remained frustratingly indistinct, a susurrus of pain and desperation. "This isn't real," Shaw said aloud, his voice shaking. "This is a dream, a hallucination. I'll wake up any moment now." But even as he spoke, he knew in his heart that this was no dream. The cold metal of the surgical tools beneath his fingers, the musty scent of decay that filled his nostrils. It was all too vivid, too present to be anything but reality. A sudden gust of wind extinguished Shaw's flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. In the blackness, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, to his horror, Shaw felt something cold and clammy wrap around his ankle. He kicked out blindly, scrambling backwards until he hit the wall. His hand scrabbled against the rough stone, searching desperately for a way out. Instead, his fingers found a loose brick. Without thinking, Shaw pulled it free. A rush of stale air hit him in the face, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay. From the hole left by the missing brick, Shaw heard a voice, clear, distinct, and filled with malice. "Welcome, Dr. Shaw," it said, its tone one of cruel amusement. "We've been waiting for you." Before Shaw could react, he felt hands, dozens of them reaching out from the wall, grasping at his clothes, his hair, his skin. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The hands pulled him inexorably towards the hole in the wall, which seemed to be widening, becoming a gaping maw ready to swallow him whole. As the darkness closed in around him, the last thing Shaw saw was a face emerging from the shadows. The face of Dr. Elias Vance, twisted into a rictus grin of madness and triumph. Then the wall closed around him, and Dr. Marcus Shaw, man of science and reason, vanished into the hungry depths of Blackthorn Asylum. Darkness, absolute and all-encompassing. Dr. Marcus Shaw floated in a void, devoid of light, sound, or sensation. How long he had been there, he couldn't say. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this lightless abyss. Was he dead? Had the horrors of Blackthorn Asylum finally driven him to madness? Or was this simply another vivid hallucination, a product of his stressed and overstimulated mind? As if in answer to his unspoken questions, a pinprick of light appeared in the distance. It grew slowly, expanding like the iris of some colossal eye opening to regard him with cold curiosity. Shaw felt himself being drawn towards it, pulled by an unseen force that he was powerless to resist. The light engulfed him, and suddenly he was falling, tumbling through a kaleidoscope of fractured memories and half-formed nightmares. Faces flashed before him, contorted in agony, screaming silently, their features melting and reforming in grotesque patterns. He recognized some of them from the patient files he had examined, while others were strangers, their eyes accusing and filled with a terrible, knowing pity. With a jolt that knocked the breath from his lungs, Shaw found himself lying on a cold stone floor. Gasping, he pushed himself to his knees, his head spinning as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. He was in a circular chamber, its high ceiling lost in shadows. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing a statue of a hooded figure, their blank faces turned towards the center of the room. In the middle of the chamber stood a pedestal, upon which rested an ancient-looking book bound in what appeared to be human skin. Despite the revulsion that rose in his throat, Shaw felt himself drawn to it, an insatiable curiosity overriding his fear and disgust. As he approached the pedestal, the air around him seemed to thicken, becoming almost gelatinous. Each step was a struggle, as if he were wading through molasses. When he finally reached the book, Shaw hesitated, his hand hovering inches above its gruesome cover. "Go on, doctor," a voice whispered, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You came here seeking knowledge, did you not? Open it. Read. Understand." Shaw's hand trembled as he reached for the book. The moment his fingers touched its surface, a jolt of energy surged through him, and the chamber around him dissolved into a whirlwind of images and sensations. He saw Blackthorn Asylum as it had been in its prime, a beacon of modern psychiatric treatment, its halls bustling with doctors and nurses. But beneath the veneer of progress and healing, a darker current ran. In hidden rooms and secret passages, unspeakable experiments were conducted. Patients screamed as their minds were torn apart and reassembled according to the whims of a man obsessed with unlocking the secrets of human consciousness. Dr. Elias Vance's face loomed large in these visions, his eyes burning with a fanatical light as he presided over torture disguised as treatment. Shaw watched in horror as Vance drove patient after patient to the brink of madness and beyond, all in pursuit of what he called the pure form of the human psyche. The vision shifted, showing Shaw the night when everything went wrong. The patients, driven beyond the limits of human endurance, rose up in a frenzy of violence and madness. They tore through the asylum, slaughtering staff members and freeing their fellow inmates. The halls of Blackthorn ran red with blood as chaos reigned. But even as the patients reveled in their momentary freedom, something else was stirring. The very walls of the asylum seemed to come alive, pulsing with an eldritch energy born from years of suffering and madness. As Shaw watched, helpless to intervene, he saw the patients and remaining staff members consumed by this malevolent force. Their screams cut short as they were absorbed into the very fabric of the building. At the heart of it all stood Dr. Vance, his arms raised in triumph even as the asylum's hungry shadows enveloped him. His laughter echoed through the centuries, a sound of pure, unadulterated madness. With a gasp, Shaw tore his hand away from the book, stumbling backwards. He found himself once again in the circular chamber, but it had changed. The statues in their alcoves had turned to face him, their blank visages now bearing the twisted features of Blackthorn's victims. "Now you begin to understand, Dr. Shaw," the disembodied voice said, its tone one of cruel amusement. "But your education is far from complete." Before Shaw could respond, the floor beneath him gave way, and he was falling once more. He landed hard on a metal surface, the impact driving the air from his lungs. As he struggled to breathe, fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, revealing his new surroundings. He was lying on an operating table in what appeared to be a modernized version of the asylum's surgical theater. The room was a nightmarish blend of old and new. State-of-the-art medical equipment stood alongside archaic devices of torture, all of it stained with fresh blood. Shaw tried to move, only to find that he was strapped down, thick leather restraints binding him to the table. Panic rising in his throat, he thrashed against his bonds, but they only seemed to tighten with each movement. Now, doctor," a familiar voice chided. "That's no way for a man of science to behave." Dr. Elias Vance stepped into Shaw's field of vision, looking exactly as he had in the visions. A tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He was dressed in a blood-stained lab coat, a surgical mask hanging loosely around his neck. "You've come seeking answers," Vance said, his voice silky smooth. "And I, in my benevolence, have decided to grant them to you. But knowledge, true knowledge, comes at a price. Are you willing to pay it, Dr. Shaw?" Shaw wanted to refuse, to tell this madman that he wanted no part of his insane quest for knowledge. But when he opened his mouth, he found himself saying, "Yes, show me." Vance's smile widened, becoming something inhuman and terrible. "Excellent," he purred, reaching for a tray of surgical instruments. "Then let us begin." What followed was an eternity of pain and horror. Vance's scalpel bit into Shaw's flesh, peeling back layers of skin and muscle with surgical precision. But instead of blood and viscera, each incision revealed new horrors, twisted landscapes, alien geometries, and creatures that defied description. "Do you see?" Vance asked as he worked, his voice fever-bright with excitement. "The human body is but a shell, a fragile barrier between our limited perception and the true nature of reality. I have found a way to bridge that gap, to open the mind to the infinite possibilities that lie just beyond the veil of our understanding." Shaw screamed as Vance's scalpel delved deeper, not just into his flesh, but into the very fabric of his being. He felt his sanity begin to unravel, his mind struggling to process the impossible vistas that were being revealed to him. And then, just when he thought he could endure no more, everything stopped. The pain vanished, and Shaw found himself standing in a long corridor, his body whole and unmarked. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar, a warm, inviting light spilling out from behind it. Hesitantly, Shaw began to walk towards the door. With each step, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, as if he were shedding the accumulated traumas of his ordeal. By the time he reached the door, he felt lighter than air, filled with a sense of peace and purpose he had never known before. He pushed the door open, stepping into a room that was the very picture of normalcy. A cozy office with bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk dominating the center. Behind the desk sat a man who could have been Vance's twin, but his eyes were kind, his smile genuine. "Welcome, Dr. Shaw," the man said, gesturing to a comfortable-looking chair across from him. "Please have a seat. We have much to discuss." Shaw sat, his mind reeling from the sudden shift in reality. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What is this place?" The man's smile widened. "I am what Dr. Vance could have been, had he not lost himself to madness and obsession. As for where we are, think of it as a way station, a place between realities where we can speak freely." "I don't understand," Shaw said, shaking his head. "The things I've seen, the horrors I've experienced, were they real?" "As real as anything in this world," the man replied. "Blackthorn Asylum exists in a liminal space, Dr. Shaw. It is a nexus point where the barriers between realities have worn thin. What you experienced were echoes of past traumas, amplified and given form by the collective madness that has seeped into the very stones of that place." The man leaned forward, his expression grave. "But it is more than that. Blackthorn has become a living entity, feeding on the pain and suffering of those trapped within its walls. And now, it hungers for more. It seeks to expand beyond its boundaries, to spread its influence into the world beyond." Shaw felt a chill run down his spine. "What can be done?" he asked. "How can it be stopped?" The man sighed, a sound filled with infinite sorrow. "That, Dr. Shaw, is where you come in. You have been chosen not by any higher power, but by the inexorable flow of fate. You alone have the potential to end this cycle of madness and pain." "But how?" Shaw asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm just one man. What can I possibly do against something like this?" The man stood, walking around the desk to place a hand on Shaw's shoulder. "You must go deeper," he said, "into the heart of Blackthorn, to the place where it all began. There, you will find the source of its power and the means to destroy it." "And if I fail?" Shaw whispered, already knowing the answer. The man's grip tightened, his eyes filled with a terrible knowledge. "Then you will join the countless others who have been consumed by Blackthorn's hunger. Your soul will become part of the asylum, trapped for eternity in a nightmare from which there is no awakening." Shaw closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, determination had replaced the fear in his gaze. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. The man nodded, a look of pride and sorrow crossing his face. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "Deep beneath the asylum lies a chamber that predates the building itself. It is a place of ancient power, where the boundaries between worlds are at their weakest. Vance discovered it and used it to fuel his mad experiments, not realizing the true nature of what he was tampering with." He paused, making sure Shaw was following. "In that chamber you will find a device, a mechanism of eldritch design that serves as a conduit between our world and something else. It is the source of Blackthorn's power, the anchor that keeps it tethered to our reality." "And I'm supposed to, what, destroy this device?" Shaw asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. The man shook his head. "Not destroy. Reverse. The device can be used to close the breach, to seal off Blackthorn from the other realities it feeds upon. But doing so will require a sacrifice." Shaw felt his blood run cold. "What kind of sacrifice?" "A willing soul," the man said softly. "Someone to take the place of all those trapped within Blackthorn's walls, to serve as a guardian, ensuring that the breach remains closed for all eternity." The implications of what the man was saying hit Shaw like a physical blow. "You're asking me to give up everything," the man finished for him. "Your life, your future, your very essence. It is an enormous ask, I know. But you've seen what will happen if Blackthorn is allowed to continue unchecked. The horrors you've witnessed are but a fraction of what it is capable of." Shaw stood, pacing the small office as he tried to process what he was being told. "How do I know this is real?" he asked finally. "How do I know this isn't just another trick, another layer of the asylum's madness?" The man smiled sadly. "You don't," he said simply. "Faith, Dr. Shaw, is the final frontier of the scientific mind. You must decide whether to trust your experiences, your instincts, or to dismiss them as the products of a diseased mind." Shaw stopped pacing, turning to face the man. "If I do this," he said slowly, "what happens to the others? The souls trapped in Blackthorn? They will be freed," the man replied. Their torment will end and they will be able to move on to whatever awaits beyond this life. Your sacrifice would grant them the peace they have been denied for so long." Shaw closed his eyes, his mind racing. Everything he had experienced, everything he had seen and felt since entering Blackthorn Asylum, went against everything he had believed as a man of science. And yet he could not deny the truth of what he had witnessed. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with a grim determination. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. The man nodded, a look of profound respect crossing his face. "Remember this," he said, his voice taking on an otherworldly resonance. "In the depths of Blackthorn, where sanity frays and reality bends, seek the door that should not be. Beyond it lies the heart of madness, the nexus of all realities. There you will find your destiny." As the man spoke, the office around them began to fade, the warm light giving way to encroaching shadows. Shaw felt a pulling sensation, as if he were being drawn back into the nightmare he had briefly escaped. "Wait," he called out as the man's figure began to blur. "Who are you, really?" The man's smile was the last thing to fade, lingering like the Cheshire Cat's grin. "I am you, Dr. Shaw," his voice echoed. "The you that might have been, and the you that might yet be. Now go. Blackthorn awaits." With a gut-wrenching lurch, Shaw found himself back in the asylum's twisting corridors. The warmth and safety of the office were gone, replaced by the oppressive atmosphere of Blackthorn. But something had changed. The whispers that had haunted him before were silent now, replaced by a single insistent thought. Deeper, he had to go deeper. With renewed purpose, Shaw began to make his way through the asylum's labyrinthine halls. Doors that had been locked before now swung open at his touch, revealing staircases that spiraled downwards into impenetrable darkness. As he descended, the very air seemed to thicken, becoming charged with an eldritch energy that made his skin crawl. The walls pulsed with an unhealthy light, veins of some phosphorescent fungus tracing patterns that hurt the eye to follow. How long he walked, Shaw couldn't say. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the depths of Blackthorn. He passed through chambers that defied the laws of physics, where gravity shifted and reality itself seemed to warp and bend. More than once he found himself walking on ceilings or passing through walls that rippled like water. Throughout it all, Shaw clung to his sense of purpose. Whatever tricks or terrors Blackthorn might conjure, he would not be deterred. The fate of countless souls rested on his shoulders, and he would not fail them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of descent, Shaw found himself standing before a massive door. It was a thing of nightmare, crafted from some material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Twisted faces writhed across its surface, their silent screams a testament to the horrors that lay beyond. This was it, the door that should not be, the entrance to the heart of Blackthorn's madness. Taking a deep breath, Shaw placed his hand on the door. It swung open silently, revealing a vast chamber beyond. As he stepped through, he knew with grim certainty that whatever lay ahead would determine not just his fate, but the fate of all those trapped within Blackthorn's hungry embrace. The time had come to face the final test, to confront the source of Blackthorn's power and perhaps to bring an end to the nightmare once and for all. As Dr. Marcus Shaw stepped into the vast chamber beyond the impossible door, he felt reality itself shudder around him. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to press against his very soul, threatening to unmake him with each breath. The chamber defied description, its dimensions shifting and warping in ways that made Shaw's mind reel. Walls became floors, became ceilings in a dizzying dance of non-Euclidean geometry. In the center of this maelstrom of madness stood a device that could only be the work of a mind unbound by the laws of our universe. It was a massive construct of unknowable metal and pulsing organic matter, its form constantly shifting and reforming. Tendrils of energy arced from its surface, connecting to the writhing walls of the chamber. With a start, Shaw realized that the device wasn't just in the chamber. It was the chamber, the asylum, everything. This was the heart of Blackthorn, the nexus point where all realities converged. As Shaw approached, he became aware of a presence behind him. Turning, he found himself face to face with Dr. Elias Vance, or what remained of him. The man's form flickered and shifted, sometimes appearing as the distinguished Dr. Shaw had seen in visions, other times as a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and shadow. "Welcome, Dr. Shaw," Vance's voice echoed, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome to the culmination of my life's work. Isn't it glorious?" Shaw felt revulsion rise in his throat, but he forced it down. "This is madness, Vance," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "You've torn apart the fabric of reality itself," Vance laughed, a sound that sent shivers down Shaw's spine. "Madness? No, my dear colleague. This is enlightenment. I have peered beyond the veil of our limited perception and seen the true nature of existence. Reality is malleable, consciousness infinite. With this device, I have tapped into the wellspring of creation itself." As Vance spoke, the chamber around them pulsed with sickly light. Faces formed in the writhing walls, the souls of Blackthorn's victims, trapped for eternity in this nightmare realm. "And at what cost?" Shaw demanded, gesturing to the tortured visages surrounding them. "How many lives have you destroyed in pursuit of your enlightenment?" For a moment, something like regret flickered across Vance's ever-shifting features. "Sacrifices were necessary," he said, his voice softer now. "You cannot create a new world without breaking the old one. These souls, they are not lost, Dr. Shaw. They have become part of something greater. They live on through me, through Blackthorn." Shaw shook his head, disgust and pity warring within him. "They're trapped, Vance, suffering endlessly in this hell you've created. It has to end." Vance's form solidified, his eyes burning with a fanatical light. "End? Oh no, Dr. Shaw. This is only the beginning. Blackthorn hungers. It has tasted the infinite and now it craves more. Soon it will spread beyond these walls, remaking the world in its image. And you will help me usher in this new age of enlightenment." With a gesture from Vance, tendrils of shadow shot out from the walls, wrapping around Shaw's limbs. He struggled against their grip, but they were inhumanly strong, pulling him towards the pulsing heart of the device. "Join us, Dr. Shaw," Vance's voice whispered in his ear, full of terrible promise. "Embrace the madness. Become one with Blackthorn and experience eternity." As the tendrils pulled him closer to the device, Shaw felt his mind begin to fracture. Visions of impossible realms flashed before his eyes, realities where the laws of physics were mere suggestions and consciousness expanded beyond the confines of individual minds. For a moment he was tempted. The knowledge offered was intoxicating, the promise of power and understanding beyond human comprehension, alluring in its infinitude. But then he remembered the faces in the walls, the souls trapped in endless torment. He thought of the world beyond Blackthorn's walls, of the people who would suffer if this madness were allowed to spread. With a Herculean effort of will, Shaw tore his gaze away from the visions. "No," he growled through gritted teeth. "This ends now." Summoning every ounce of strength he possessed, Shaw began to push back against the tendrils holding him. As he struggled, he felt something awaken within him, a power he hadn't known he possessed, born from the trials he had endured in the depths of Blackthorn. "Impossible," Vance hissed, his form flickering rapidly as he sensed the change in Shaw. "You cannot resist. Blackthorn's will is absolute." But Shaw was beyond hearing. His mind focused on a single thought, a memory of the words spoken to him in that liminal office. "The device can be used to close the breach, to seal off Blackthorn from the other realities it feeds upon. But doing so will require a sacrifice." With a final, mighty effort, Shaw broke free from the shadowy tendrils. Before Vance could react, he lunged forward, placing his hands directly on the pulsing core of the device. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Energy surged through Shaw's body, threatening to tear him apart at the molecular level. But he held on, forcing his will upon the machine, bending it to his purpose. "No!" Vance screamed, his form dissolving into a maelstrom of shadow and light. "What have you done?" Shaw didn't answer, couldn't answer. Every fiber of his being was focused on the task at hand, on reversing the flow of energy that had kept Blackthorn tethered to the realms beyond. The chamber began to shake violently, reality itself seeming to rebel against what was happening. The faces in the walls cried out, not in pain now, but in relief, as the bonds holding them began to weaken. "You fool," Vance's voice echoed, growing fainter with each passing second. "You'll destroy everything." "No," Shaw managed to gasp out, even as he felt his own essence being drawn into the device. "I'm saving everything." With a sound like the universe itself tearing apart, the device imploded. A shockwave of pure energy radiated outward, disintegrating the walls of the chamber and racing through every corridor and room of Blackthorn Asylum. In that moment of destruction, Shaw saw it all. He saw the souls of Blackthorn's victims finally finding peace, moving on to whatever lay beyond. He saw the asylum's malevolent influence receding, the tendrils it had extended into other realities withering and dying. And he saw himself, his consciousness expanding to fill every corner of Blackthorn. No longer a victim or a prisoner, but a guardian, a seal between worlds, ensuring that the horrors contained within could never again threaten the world beyond. As the last vestiges of his human form dissolved, merging with the very fabric of Blackthorn, Dr. Marcus Shaw allowed himself a final, weary smile. He had done it. The nightmare was over. In the world above, Blackthorn Asylum shuddered once, a tremor that shook it to its foundations. Then slowly it began to crumble. Walls collapsed, floors caved in, and the once imposing structure folded in on itself like a house of cards. By the time the authorities arrived, drawn by reports of strange lights and unearthly sounds, there was little left of Blackthorn but a pile of rubble. As they picked through the debris, they found no bodies, no evidence of the horrors that had transpired within those accursed walls. But those who ventured near the ruins in the years that followed would sometimes speak of a presence they felt. Not malevolent, but watchful, protective, as if something was standing guard, ensuring that the boundary between our world and the realms beyond remained forever sealed. And on quiet nights when the wind whispered through the trees surrounding the former site of Blackthorn Asylum, some swore they could hear a voice. Faint but clear, it seemed to say, "Rest now, you are safe, the nightmare is over." In time, the ruins of Blackthorn were reclaimed by nature. Trees grew where once corridors had stretched, and wildlife made its home in the foundations of the asylum. To all outward appearances, it was as if the place had never existed. But deep beneath the earth, in a chamber that existed between realities, something remained. A consciousness, spread thin but ever vigilant. The last guardian of a door now closed, keeper of secrets that must never again see the light of day. And there, in the silence and the dark, Dr. Marcus Shaw kept his eternal vigil. A sacrifice freely given, a hero unsung, forever standing watch against the night.